All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. First, I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar and thank you all so much for joining us today and taking the time to be here. My name is Kayla Ripple and I'm a principal associate with the Lenfest Ocean Program. And if you've been attending this webinar series, you probably know our spiel about what the Lenfest Ocean Program is, but for those of you who are joining us and aren't as familiar, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program, and we fund ocean and coastal research projects to address needs that are facing decision makers and stakeholders. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter to receive updates about the projects that we fund. And if you're on Twitter, please be sure to follow us at LenfestOcean. In fact, we'll be live tweeting this webinar today using the hashtag LOPwebinar. So feel free to use that too and engage with us there if you'd like to. Today is the 7th webinar in a series that highlights projects from our Climate Resilient Fisheries grant portfolio, in which we're supporting projects where scientists are working with managers and stakeholders to better understand how to navigate the challenges that climate change poses to fisheries. So these projects are tackling a range of different topics and taking different pieces of the puzzle from topics ranging from predicting distribution shifts of important fish stocks, understanding the climate vulnerability of communities, and providing recommendations for adaptive management of fisheries, among many other topics. So if you're interested to learn more about those projects, my colleague Emily Knight will be dropping a link in the chat box. Here you can also view and sign up for upcoming webinars in the series. We do have webinars scheduled every month from now until January 2025. In fact, our next webinar is coming up rather quickly and will be next week on Wednesday, November 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time on informing adaptive allocation strategies for transboundary fish stocks. And Emily will drop a link for that in the chat as well. And while it's not part of this series specifically, we do have a virtual panel tomorrow that may be of interest to this group. It's a follow-up from a previous results webinar that we hosted earlier this month on using portfolio theory as a tool to advance EBFM and U.S. fisheries management. And here the research team is going to have a discussion and we'll be joined by Chip Collier with the South Atlantic Council, as well as Lisa Kerr with University of Maine and also a member of the New England Council. And they'll be discussing the feasibility of implementing tools such as portfolio theory in fisheries management. We'll drop a link to the chat in there as well. But for today's webinar, we're very excited to have joining us Abigail Golden with the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center and formerly University of Washington, Tim Essington with University of Washington, and Ariel Levine and Jackie Vogel, both with San Diego State University. They'll be sharing more about their research project to understand the role of adaptive capacity for enhancing climate resilient fisheries. And we'll drop a link to their project page in there if you'd like to follow up and learn a little bit more after the webinar as well. I'm going to let them get into the details, but for us at Lenfest, it's been really interesting to talk with this team about what they're finding. They're trying to take an academic concept and a question that seems to be floating around the fisheries management world a lot these days. Questions like how to be more nimble and flexible and how do we adapt to these changes on the ground and take that and translate it into actionable recommendations. So they're doing this by talking extensively with the people who are central and focused on the issue. A couple of papers are out now, and Emily will drop a link to those in the chat, but there's more to come. And we'll keep everyone here apprised of those as they do come out. And in just a second, I'll turn them over to actually get into the details of what they're finding. But I do have a couple of logistical things that I wanted to share before we get started. So to prevent any feedback or echoes, all attendees are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to drop your comments or other resources you think would be useful to share with others in the chat box. Maybe even feel free to introduce yourself. And if you have questions for the speakers, you can submit those in the Q&A box. I'll be keeping track of those throughout the webinar, and at the end, I'll read the questions aloud to the panelists so they can answer them. If we don't get to your question or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us or the research team members after the webinar. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and we'll follow up with and distribute the link of the recording shortly afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abigail to start sharing her screen and dive into the presentation.
Thanks so much, Kayla, for that introduction. Let me go ahead and start sharing. All right, can you see my screen in full mode? Great.
Yes.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I just want to, Kayla did a really good job introducing us in the project. I just want to emphasize that this is work that I did at the UW while I was a postdoc. And I want to especially acknowledge the list of co-authors on this initial slide, but especially Tim Essington and Ariel Levine, the co-PIs on this project who are on this call today, as well as Jacqueline Vogel, who is also here, who's been an absolutely rock star PhD student working on this project. So you're here in a climate resilient fisheries webinar. I think I don't need to try to convince you that fisheries are facing really unprecedented environmental change, from species distribution shifts to harmful algal blooms to 100-year events like Hurricane Milton, which just happened, or the unexpected and totally unprecedented collapse of the Alaska snow crab fishery a couple years ago. And in order to try to adapt to all of these stressors, we really need to understand what makes fishing communities and fishery management systems and ecosystems and people vulnerable to those stressors, and then what makes them more able to adapt. And when thinking about this idea of vulnerability to change, in academic theory, we kind of think about three things. The first is that system's exposure to the stressor. So what are the things that are facing a particular fishing community or region? And then the sensitivity of that system to change. So how reliant are people on, for example, natural resources that are affected by a harmful algal bloom? And then finally, what we think of as the adaptive capacity of people and systems to respond to that change. So people's ability to respond to or take advantage of shocks in order to lower their overall vulnerability. And this third concept of adaptive capacity is, I think, the hardest of these three to try to study and define. I'm putting up a generic definition that I use sometimes here, but I like to think about adaptive capacity in terms of a metaphor. So it's the difference between kind of leaning back on one foot, kind of off balance. If someone were to like knock you a little bit on the shoulder, you might stumble backward, versus being balanced, your weight is forward, your weight is balanced evenly on both of your feet. You're like a wrestler or a runner who is ready to move, and you don't necessarily know what direction you're going to have to move in, but you can move in that direction really quickly. And there's a kind of growing and really fascinating academic literature on the aspects of fisheries that can help enable that kind of adaptive capacity. And these include things like flexibility. So having flexible management regimes, having the ability to switch gears or species, assets. So those include natural resources as well as access to permits, loans, capital, organizational structures that are effective and that can be ecological organizations. So like stock structure, it can also be community organizations, it can be management institutions as well. Learning, so opportunities for people to learn and innovate. Agency, so people's ability to act in response to changes. And then finally, these kind of socio-cognitive ideas like your risk tolerance and your resilience mindset. And this framework is, I find really helpful and really interesting, but there's this kind of big open question of how do these really big picture and kind of abstract concepts translate into day-to-day decision-making processes that have to do with adapting fishery management systems to change. So like we know that there are all these attributes that can theoretically help us adapt, but our managers at the councils and at NIMFs, our scientists on scientific and statistical committees, thinking, how can I increase flexibility? How can I increase learning? How can I increase assets? How much do these actually translate to on-the-ground decision making? And the work that we've been doing this past few years has really tried to bridge that gap and to try to understand directly um, how managers and scientists are thinking about these big abstract academic ideas and how we can best sort of translate those ideas into a fisheries management context in a way that's useful. So in this project, we wanted to try to answer three really big questions. The first is, how can the US fishery management system adapt to change more effectively? Second, are there things that adaptation scientists like myself can do to better meet managers' needs for the kinds of information that are useful? And then third, are there any factors that are preventing the US fishery management system from adapting as well as it might otherwise be able to? And I used a couple different methodologies to try to answer these questions. For questions 1 and 2, I conducted in-depth interviews with people at a high level of the 8 fishery management council regions, so both council members and staff, and the NIMS regions, including the science centers. And then for question 3, I followed up those interviews with an online survey of people across that US fishery management enterprise who fell into the same broad categories. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about those survey methodologies a little later. And those interviews were conducted in 2022. The survey was just completed in June of this year, of 2024. So I'll start with this first question of how can the US fishery management system adapt more effectively to change? And you can read more about these results and the methods that I used in this ICES paper that I believe is in the chat as well. And as I was transcribing and analyzing and trying to understand my interviews, I was surprised to find a really strong theme emerging from basically all of them, which is that of the 20 people that I interviewed, 19 of them highlighted flexibility really strongly as being relevant to adapting to change in their regions. So you can see in this figure, this is just a simple count of the number of respondents who said that a particular domain of adaptive capacity was relevant to their region and not relevant is in green. So flexibility was by far the most commonly cited as being relevant. And if you look at the blue diamonds that are overlaid on this plot, that represents the number of people who brought that idea up before I introduced those academic domains of adaptive capacity. So to me, that tells me that these are things that are really top of mind for people. And that initial exploratory conversation often went something like this. I would say, what do you think makes a fishery more or less able to adapt to change? And people would say something like, the first principle is flexibility. So do you have the opportunity to change the way that you operate if you're a fisherman? If you're a manager, do you have a variety of policy tools at your disposal? And along with that emphasis on flexibility, people kept bringing up, yes, flexibility is really important, and it's also really constrained within the structure of the management system that we have today, because that structure limits flexibility for a lot of really intentional reasons. And I think that this quote is a good one representing this. This Mid-Atlantic Council staff member said, so the National Marine Fisheries Agency is really, I don't know if burdened is the right word, but certainly restricted by their ability to do things quickly. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing all the time, right? Because you want folks to think about a decision, to analyze it, to make sure you understand the impacts before you do it. But if you add up all the periods that are associated with public scoping and public review and agency review and council analyses, it can be a long period of time. So this issue of timelines was one example of that tension, but there were many, many more that you can read about in more detail in that paper. But thinking about that tension, I think a really important contributor to that, so what's kind of going on here is that the fishery management system that we have in the US was set up under the assumption that the future would look more or less like the past, at least in terms of environmental variability, and that you could predict what would happen in the future based on the data that we have in the past. And that's become pretty obviously untrue as climate change has intensified and changed patterns of environmental in ocean conditions worldwide. So I think one Alaska fishery scientist put this really well. He said, right now, all of our management principles are based around stationarity. Climate change is pushing us away from that at light speed. So what do we do with this? How do we deal with this kind of mismatch? I would argue that a really important thing is going to be finding a new balance between these two really important goals of having a rigorous and participatory and scientifically driven management process, and then also having flexible and adaptive management strategies. So finding a way to keep the strengths of our current system without letting that bog down innovation and change. And that's going to be hard because both of those things are important and there are trade-offs there. So to guide that rebalancing process in that paper, I recommend this rule of thumb. So to try to allow as much flexibility as possible without jeopardizing all these other adaptive traits that I mentioned earlier on. So for example, don't allow management to overshoot biological targets because then you lose that asset of abundant natural resources. Don't make management less participatory because then fishers won't have agency within that process and so on. And along with that, I think even more fundamentally, there's a real key idea of kind of needing to figure out exactly what our goals are for fisheries management and how those goals might have changed. So one scientist here on the West Coast, I think, said that really well. I think there's going to have to be some sort of dialogue with managers and with fishermen just to say, what do we mean by this? What does flexibility look like? What are the consequences of flexibility? What are the advantages of flexibility? And we have not worked through that at all. So in response to that initial question that we asked of how can the US fishery management system adapt to change, our paper proposes that one really key step forward is going to be finding a way to rebalance flexibility with the rigidity of the current system in order to adapt. And then that brings us to our second question, which is how can adaptation scientists like myself, like Ariel and Jackie and Tim, provide information that might better meet managers' needs to try to get to that place of rebalancing. And this is work that has also been published. You can check this out in this marine policy paper, which I believe is also in the chat. And this section of the talk is going to be organized into 3 main action items for scientists and for people doing this work that I identified based on those interviews. And the first one of these action items is really simple. It just has to do with language. And it's basically that as I was doing these interviews, I found that there was often a lot of linguistic slipperiness and confusion between the terms adaptive capacity and adaptive management. And that makes a ton of sense, actually, because in fisheries, we've been talking about trying to do adaptive management for like 20 years now. So this is a concept that has a lot of real estate in people's heads. And while adaptive management is certainly one way to be more adaptive overall, adaptive capacity I think of as being much broader than that, and much focused on things beyond just that management cycle. So what I'm proposing here with this action item, and I'm including myself in this, and I'm trying to do this right now, is that scientists in this field should make sure to clarify these terms and sort of call out that difference specifically when communicating with people doing this work in fisheries. The second action item is a little bit more complex, and I give a number of examples of this in the paper, but what I really want to emphasize at a high level is that we as scientists need to do a better job of operationalizing these really high level and abstract ideas about the traits that are important for adaptive capacity so that we can put them into a form that managers can actually use. And one way to do that, I think, is to leverage all of the really detailed and deep knowledge that managers have about how to make change to try to keep track of what those ideas look like on the ground. So what does that mean? Let's bring this down to earth a little bit. This is a figure from a paper that I actually really like. It's by Julia Mason and others in Fish and Fisheries. And it's this really broad sort of synthesis of the traits that go into adaptive capacity in governance systems, in socioeconomic systems, and in ecosystems. And this figure is pretty complex and pretty high level, kind of on purpose because it's talking about a lot of different things. But it's basically highlighting the idea that in order to be adaptive, governance systems should be polycentric, they should have cross-scale integration, they should have opportunities for adaptive learning. What does that mean? I don't know that that is something that someone reading this paper new to this literature would necessarily immediately jump at and say, oh, of course, this makes perfect sense to me. Um, so for example, polycentricity, it basically is the idea that organizations have these like multi-layered hierarchical structure and they're interconnected across scales. The Fishery Management Council system in the US is a really good example of that. Um, what does that actually mean for adapting? Well, one respondent that I spoke to connected that to this idea of adaptive learning and said, we're not shy about stealing ideas from other councils and improving on them. So this is a really concrete way in which that hierarchical sort of interconnected structure of the council system enables learning because it enables you to have members on adjacent bodies talk to you about what they're doing and sort of allows you to learn and to steal ideas, as you see here, which is basically just a way to operationalize this idea that like polycentricity is important for adaptation. And similarly, something that I think is missing from this diagram that the people that I spoke to for this study really sort of filled in is this idea of assets as an important piece of the adaptive capacity of governance systems and of the fishery management systems. And especially scientific assets, so scientific data collection, long time series, all of these things that are really important to being able to understand changes that are happening, but are also really expensive. So as one council member in the South Atlantic said, data costs money. If you don't have additional money for new data collection, you just have to spread your existing assets. So I think that talking to people doing on-the-ground management work is a really effective way to learn about what your theory is missing. And then my third action item here is to have a bit more of an explicit consideration of time when talking about adaptation. And time came up in a number of ways in the interviews that I did. One way was just the idea that environmental change is accelerating. It's happening faster than it used to. So one scientist in Alaska said, slow is good when climate is changing in the background, but that doesn't help you with a heat wave. Another way that this came up is the idea that time lags in management and in scientific data collection jeopardize long-term adaptation. So one scientist in the Southeast said, our really important species often only get assessed every 5 to 7 years. So from assessment to assessment, you just get a completely different picture. And then finally, kind of a counterbalance to that idea is the idea that a couple of people brought up the risk of if you're too responsive, if you're kind of chasing every last little environmental change, means that you might overreact to short-term changes that are not representative of long-term trends. So, for example, one person in the South Atlantic said, if there's a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived change in 1 year, we may do something that looks good this year, but maybe that's a temporary thing. Maybe patterns return more towards normal 2 years down the road, and how does that thing shift back? So to summarize, these three action items that I've identified in this paper are, first of all, working to build a shared definition of adaptive capacity. Second, to find ways to use managers' insights to gain a more nuanced understanding of adaptive traits. And then finally, to think more explicitly about the appropriate timing of management strategies and the timing of management and adaptive challenges as well. So that brings us to this third question here, which we talked about a little bit in the first section of this talk, but I wanted to understand a little bit more systematically what barriers are preventing the US fishery management system from adapting more effectively. And especially my goal for this piece of the study was to try to understand some of these regional differences. So assuming that different regions have really different structures. They include a really different number of states and stakeholders. The management contexts are really different. The species are really different. The environmental stressors are different. What are the sort of region-specific barriers that people are facing in each of these 8 fishery management regions? And I'm just going to say right up front, I'm actually not really going to talk about regional differences here because we didn't actually find very many, which was totally surprising and shocking to me as a scientist. That's not what I was expecting at all. But it's also kind of interesting as an indication of sort of how broad some of these, how broadly applicable some of these ideas are. So first, I promised a few more details about what this survey looked like. So this is an online survey that we distributed from April to June of 2024 through Qualtrics. Some of you on this call might have responded to it. We reached out to people at all 8 of the regional councils and the 3 interstate commissions, and we targeted specifically council and commission members, SSC members, members of advisory bodies, and what we're calling technical support staff. So targeting specifically management plan teams, the teams associated with FMPs, and also capturing some council staff, some staff assessment scientists, and so on. And I want to emphasize that this is what's called a non-probability sample in survey design. So instead of an online survey that you might have seen that gets blasted out to like a bunch of listservs and you have some, some kind of unknown response rate because you don't know how many people have seen it. In this case, we created a list of everyone who fell into these categories. We found most of their emails, and we sent that survey to everyone on that list. So to a census of the people participating in this process in the ways that we identified as being relevant to our survey. And this is powerful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it means that you can know your response rate in a really precise way. And as you're collecting data, you can tell if certain regions or roles are over or underrepresented, and you can sort of target your follow-ups to try to reach those people, the people who are underrepresented more specifically, and can also help you interpret results. If you're like, oh, we have a huge underrepresentation in, for example, the Pacific region, which was not actually true, but it's just an example. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit in our discussion section, for instance. And then finally, I just want to say we got over 300 responses, and that was about a 31% response rate, which is pretty good for an online survey of this kind. And that we were able to identify that the response rates for each region and role in management were pretty proportional to what we saw in the sampling frame. So I feel fairly confident that these results are kind of representative of people involved in this process as a whole, so representative of the 8 regions. And I won't share those demographic information here, but I'm happy to share if people are curious in the Q&A. So to ask about barriers to adaptation in particular, we started with this question or this text. There are many reasons not to think about adapting to change when you're making fishery management decisions. How much do the following statements match your experience? And then we provided specific statements like each of these and asked people's degree of agreement with the statements, with blue being disagree and red being agree. And we're using the percentage agreement with those statements as a measure of the salience of each barrier. And this list of barriers was developed with the help of an advisory body and an advisory panel for this project, made up of sort of people within this sampling frame, as well as through pre-testing and through refinement through the interview process. And yeah, that's just that key there for the colors. And this gives you a plot like this one, where each row is the percent agreement or disagreement for a given barrier, organized by percent agreement. And this is a really, really information-dense plot. I don't expect you to be able to parse it over the screen here. I'm going to kind of go through it piece by piece to highlight a few key findings here. And in particular, we're going to focus on the top of this plot and the bottom of this plot. So the most important barriers overall and the least important barriers. And I'm organizing the talk this way because those barriers were really consistent across regions and roles. So we can say with a lot of confidence that kind of the ones at the top are the most important barriers to adaptation throughout the US management system. The bottom barriers are kind of the least important. And I just want to start off with a kind of simple result, which is we confirmed our interview results. So the second barrier here, the second most salient barrier is management processes are too rigid to provide the flexibility needed to adapt. The actual text was a little bit longer, but that's the gist of it, with about 72% agreement. And if we break this out by region and role, so we have those plots by role on the top here and plots by region on the bottom, that's pretty strongly conserved across regions and roles. So there's greater than 50% agreement, and usually that looks more like 60 or 65% agreement. So that was just sort of a nice confirmation of what we'd already identified as being important in the interviews, but we're now able to say is more kind of broadly borne out. The next result I want to spend a little bit more time on, which is that the number one barrier across all of the regions and all of the roles in management across this entire data set was this one here. So stakeholders in my region are focused on protecting their interests or the status quo, and that makes it hard to adapt. And if you, again, break this out by region and by role, there's even more consistency here. So it's well over 75% agreement in all of these regions and in all of these roles. There's a really small sliver of people who are disagreeing with this statement, and they're not strongly disagreeing. So I wanted to try to understand this a little bit more. So I went back to my interviews where we talked a little bit about barriers, or actually we talked quite a lot about barriers to adaptation. And I'm still combing through this data, so this is still in sort of rough format. But this barrier did come up a lot. People spent a lot of time talking about it. And I want to give one kind of representative quote here from someone in the Northeast. So this person said, if you're going to give somebody quota, that means you're taking it away from somebody else. And that sort of give and take of quota and of fish creates a real challenge for managers. It becomes a very difficult situation to say, yes, I took your fish away and gave them to somebody 2 states away because that's how we're going to be more adaptive to climate change. Yes, that's how the fishery is going to be more adapted to climate change. It doesn't help me, the fisherman, at all. And I want to point out 2 things here. First of all, this is totally rational behavior. So I'm not trying to like blame stakeholders or blame fishermen here. People have really strong, important vested interests in fisheries and depend on them for a lot of their livelihoods. And it makes a lot of sense that people will fight to hold on to that investment. And 2, that this comes back to the idea of flexibility, and especially that there are trade-offs between providing flexibility for managers, so providing more regulatory options, and providing more flexibility to fishers, because providing more flexibility to fishers means that you have fewer options as a manager. So this kind of comes back to this idea that structural barriers are really, really key here. So that brings me to the very bottom of this figure. So the least salient barriers, the ones that people most strongly disagreed with. And these are all barriers related to thinking that change is happening and thinking that we need to adapt. So again, blue here means that people are disagreeing with the statements. And the statements are, I do not think adapting to change is necessary because I don't see change occurring. I don't believe that the concept of adaptive capacity is helpful. And other people in my region think adapting to change is not necessary because they don't see changes occurring. And again, if we break this out by region and role, all the way at the bottom here, we've got that barrier of, I don't think adapting to change is necessary because I don't see big changes occurring. And there's like 4 to 8% agreement with that in any particular role. Mostly there's this like big, strong block of strong disagreement, kind of regardless of who you're talking to. Interestingly, if you ask people or if you provide the statement, other people don't see changes happening, or other people don't think adapting to change is necessary because they don't see changes happening. There's a lot more variation here, with advisory panel members and council and commission members much more likely to agree with this one, SSC members and those technical support staff much more likely to disagree, and some interesting regional patterns as well, which kind of makes sense to me. So the groups, the roles that have the most interaction with the general public rather than our kind of scientific bubble are more likely to say that other people disagree with, or other people don't see the need to adapt. And there's lower agreement with this statement in places like the North Pacific and New England and the Mid-Atlantic, which have pretty strong climate signals occurring already. So where does this leave us in sort of this broader project of understanding the uses of, or the how to think about adapting to change in the US management system? First of all, we've identified this need to try to rebalance flexibility and rigidity within that management system, with the understanding that flexibility is complex and that flexibility for different groups is going to provide, or there are going to be trade-offs between them. Second, there's a need for adaptation scientists, or an opportunity for adaptation scientists to provide more tangible guidance, especially around things like the timing of adaptation and what adaptive traits actually look like in practice. And then finally, through our surveys, what I take away from this is that these structural barriers, so things related to how the management system is set up and the sort of needs that people have from fisheries, are most salient barriers to adaptation. It's not that people don't think that we need to adapt or don't recognize the need for change or don't have the information needed to change, which in some ways is kind of a harder pill to swallow because structural things are always more complex to change. And as I close this talk, I want to sort of give one of my interview respondents the final word, because they're really the experts here, not me. So a scientist that I spoke to on the West Coast said, "We're talking about radical changes happening in the next 30 to 50 years. Adaptation might mean adapting into something very, very different than what you are now. In which case, what does it even mean to be resilient? I don't know. That's not something I've resolved for myself." So I wanted to leave you all with this open question. I'm really interested in continuing to talk about this idea in the Q&A, and I would love to hear from you. I'm now, as Kayla mentioned at the beginning, at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center associated with the Climate, Ecosystems, and Fisheries Initiative. And please feel free to reach out about any aspect of this work, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you, Abigail. And I would invite the other research team members who are here today to also join us on video and join us for the Q&A. We did have a couple of responses and questions come into the Q&A already, but please keep submitting them. We have plenty of time to discuss them and go over some of these concepts and questions that you may have had. But the first question in the chat, I'm going to try to combine it because it's sort of, there was like two parts to it. But I'm also wanting to expand a little bit more on it to make it maybe more in the realm of the research questions that you were looking at. But this person is interested to know how fishers and management agencies can use concepts of adaptive management to coexist with things like floating ocean wind farms in the Gulf of Maine. And I would go beyond that to say, how could some of these concepts potentially be translated to other parts of fisheries management where constraints outside of climate change may pose some barriers to fishing and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because the Gulf of Maine is a great example of that, but I know on the West Coast and in lots of other places, there's going to be sort of increasing ocean uses and potential spatial conflicts between fisheries and other uh, uses, and those are going to be a really important thing to adapt to. And something that I say pretty often is like I am studying climate change in particular, but adapting to change is we all do that all the time, and fishermen are used to doing that all the time. And often these principles apply to sort of adapting to environmental change, but also to regulatory change or to market change. So that these principles are kind of the same regardless of what the exposure is. And specifically when it comes to things like those conflicts with other uses of spatial uses of the ocean, I think that really gets back to that question of sort of what are our goals? What are the things that we want to maintain about fisheries into the future? What are the things that we really want to prioritize? Because the answers to the question of how to adapt to wind farms is going to be different depending on like, well, we want to maintain um, the highest amount of protein that we possibly can out of fisheries versus we want to make sure that we're not putting individual vessels out of business, or we want to make sure that fishing communities still have robust ports. Those are all going to be kind of different goals, and it's going to be important to sort of talk about those a little bit more explicitly, I think.
Great. And what about commercial and recreational fishery assets? This person gives the example of when the New England Fishery Management Council proposed a new permit structure for commercial fishing on Georgia's banks. They were confronted by fishers who were fearful of losing their capital investments in a fishing method in their permit portfolio. So maybe you can expand a little more on that.
Yeah, so if I understand the question, that really ties back to that barrier of, a key barrier to adapting is stakeholders within the system who have some aspects of permit rights, some aspects of sort of reliance on the system as it is today, resisting that change because it will have real consequences for them. And I should say that I don't really have solutions for that. The survey work it's still in progress. We're still working on those manuscripts, and I can't say, this is what I think we should do. But I do think that that's a really fundamental challenge. That's kind of if we can solve that, then we're going to be well on our way, I think. Um, and if people who are cleverer than me have ideas, I am very curious about them.
Awesome. Anyone else from the research team want to chime in?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind just chiming in. I completely agree with Abigail. And I feel like if we were starting this project fresh right now with what we know, I suspect that's actually where we would drill down into like how do we resolve this problem of I can't even imagine like a solution. It seems actually so unwieldy. Whenever you grant access, infrastructure is going to build around it. Beliefs and values in terms of ownership are going to evolve and develop. And I think this is a really hard thing. So I completely agree. Like I don't have the answer either, but I think you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the rub that we kind of landed on.
Yeah, just to echo what Tim said, we were a little surprised that the top barrier that came out was stakeholders being focused on protecting their own interests, which in hindsight we shouldn't have been surprised at all. But but it's always fun to be surprised when you're doing research. And yeah, like Abigail and Tim, I don't necessarily have the answer to this question, but I do think that the framework and some of the recommendations that Abigail presented about when you're trying to enhance the adaptive capacity of a system to make sure if you're, building adaptive capacity in one domain, like flexibility in terms of where permits are issued, and who has access to them, that you don't reduce flexibility in another domain, like reducing fishermen's flexibility in terms of their portfolio. And how do you or in terms of assets that they've invested in that they, no longer can use. And so are there ways to somehow, make sure you don't lose those other domains when building adaptive capacity in a different domain? I think those are questions that we're really going to have to wrestle with, and think, are there ways to compensate? Are there ways to provide alternative assets or alternative, means to be flexible? I think I don't have an answer, but I think these are, questions that we need to think about.
Absolutely. For the barrier study, were there any barriers in the middle that did have more spread based on region or role, or were they also consistently middle ranked?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The answer to that is, yeah, there's a lot more variation in that middle of the pack. And I'm still working on combing through that, so I can't tell you which ones those are yet. But I have like a whole folder of figures, just like the ones that I showed that I'm kind of itching to go through. But that might have to be a later paper, just because there's so much here.
Yeah, from this work, do you have any takeaways for how the research team and monitoring programs, like fisheries dependent or independent, uh, can help support climate informed management approaches and provide the most useful data sets for that purpose?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I that came up a lot in the interviews, and I would say I have a few sort of themes in mind or sort of recommendations that I heard. One of them is don't stop doing your surveys. Like you need those long-term time sets or time series. You can't do anything unless you sort of understand where you're coming from. Another one is finding ways to, especially in the context of species distribution shifts, kind of creatively adapt and expand those surveys to be consistent across regions where maybe you've got a jurisdictional boundary and like the South Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic does their survey in a different way. Well, suddenly you've got species that are moving across that boundary. How do you make sure that you're tracking those fish across Cape Hatteras or whatever it is? And then also to just sort of find ways to get more creative about the kind of data that you're collecting. And are you going further offshore now? How are you dealing with maybe spatial footprints of uh, offshore wind development that are kind of in the middle of your survey path? And just sort of getting back to that idea of innovate, but don't jeopardize what you already have.
Right, thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that? Or Abigail got it covered? Perfect. We don't have any other questions in the Q&A box, but I did have one question that I wanted to ask the research team here before we jump off. You know, this you were trying to answer an academic concept, right? And are we any closer to being able to put these recommendations to use in management? And how would you like to expand on some of the research that you did here? And what other questions did it sort of bring up for you in ways to apply it in other ways, in like a more real sense of on the ground management terms?
Yeah, I think that this has kind of advanced the usability of this academic field a bit. I think it's also, we've been kind of missing an understanding of, a bunch of uh, studies of, synthesis of the literature or workshops of academics and kind of things have said like, these are the principles we think are important. I think an advancement is the ability that we had here to rank these in terms of relevance to people doing this work. So just sort of understand which ones of those are both most important and most constrained. And then also identifying what those barriers are. Like as Tim said, we've now done enough work to understand where we should have started. Uh, so if there were sort of another iteration of this project or a new project, I think a really key place to start would be that question of uh, how do we deal with sort of identifying and uh, moving forward given the needs of stakeholders, and given the barrier that those needs represent. And then also I think just we're now in a place where maybe we can do a little bit more ground truthing of these concepts. We have, unfortunately, enough climate shocks that we can start to understand how people have adapted to them in the past and which of these principles have been important and how they've been how they've shown up. So we can maybe start to develop a playbook for what we need to do in the future. And I don't think that's work that would have been as possible even 10 years ago. But we're unfortunately in a place now where people have had to adapt really quickly to really intense changes.
One thing that maybe I would was thinking about was to a large extent the interviews and the surveys that Abigail conducted revealed that the academic concepts already kind of existed in large part in a lot of the fishery practitioners. They just call them different words. So a lot of those dimensions were already kind of front and center. And I think one of the key finding recommendation is like learn how to talk to people. We had like this kind of dope slap moment when like I'll use this one example. I hope this group doesn't mind. So adaptive capacity and adaptive management was one example of linguistic uncertainty that kind of cropped up. The other one was agency. Like agency is a word that we use in adaptive capacity to talk about the ability to sort of self-determine, and you have some control. But you're talking to people who are in policy circles, and they're like, "Yeah, I got lots of agencies. I got one right over there, and I got another one right over there, and another one over there." So being careful about the language from the academic side, even when you're giving the recommendation, I think that was a point that Abigail really made really well. I think that's a really important piece.
Excellent. All right. Well, not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, we can go ahead and log off. But first, I want to just say thank you to our panelists today. Thank you, Abigail, for running us through that presentation and walking us through all of your results. We'll be following up with everybody who attended the webinar with the recording, and please feel free to share that afterwards. Oh, wait, we did just get one question, and we have time. So I'm going to ask it. So nearly 75% of our Western Pacific region's EEZ will be closed to commercial fishing due to monuments. How can the principles of adaptive capacity aid fisheries management in our area when mandates come from the top? So kind of similar to the first question we had talked about.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and is definitely a discussion that I had with in the interviews related to that region. And I think that is so putting on my UW postdoc hat, not my NOAA hat, that if you think about it in that adaptive capacity framework, that is a case where flexibility is strongly limited, or where maybe one goal has been met, so a goal of protecting natural resources, protecting assets at the cost of flexibility. And I don't really have a solution to that trade-off, just an identification that yes, that is a trade-off. And that is also relates to that idea of sort of polycentricity, where you have these hierarchical and interconnected management structures, where in some cases management goals at one level of that hierarchy might be very different from management goals at a different level of that hierarchy.
Great.
If Tim or Ariel or Jackie have further thoughts, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I mean, I think maybe, trying to think of how a better understanding of what adaptive capacity is and what it means to fisheries might be able to help with a problem like this. And I think maybe just in terms of articulating what the challenges are for fishermen when something like this happens, because you are meeting one domain of adaptive capacity by trying to protect resources and protect the assets of fisheries, but you're constraining a lot of other domains for fishermen in terms of flexibility and where they fish, in terms of their access to fisheries and in terms of their agency, in terms of where they can go fishing. And so just using this as a way to frame what the trade-offs are, and why this could make it harder for fishermen in the future at adapting to a changing climate, and are there, ways that we could address those challenges that arise from a policy decision like, establishing monuments.
Excellent. All right, that was our last question. So now we will log off. Thank you everyone again very much for joining us, and thanks to our panelists. We'll be following up with you all. Have a great day.
Thanks, Kayla.
Bye everyone.